all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. This is your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Professor Stephen C. Finley, the inaugural chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Louisiana State University. Professor Finley is the co-editor of Esotericism and African American Religious Experience. There is a Mystery, co-edited with Margarita Simon Guillory and Hugh R. Page Jr. He's also the co-editor of Religion of White Rage, White Workers, Religious Fervor, and the Myth of Black Racial Progress, co-edited with his colleagues at LSU, Laurie Latrice Martin and Biko Mandela Gray. And he's joining us here today to talk about his new book, published by our friends at Duke University Press, In and Out of This World, Material and Extraterrestrial Bodies in the Nation of Islam. Of In and Out of This World, Herbert Berg, author of Elijah Muhammad and Islam, writes, Stephen C. Finley provides unique and intriguing insights into the four most prominent African-American Muslims, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Warith Deen Mohammed, and Louis Farrakhan. His comparison of these charismatic and influential leaders and his focus on the body, both material and extraterrestrial, provides valuable new perspectives, not only on the Nation of Islam as a religious movement, but also on the often tense and competitive relationships between these men as each struggles with the religious meaning of Black embodiment. How are you doing today, Professor Finley?
I'm doing pretty well. Happy to be here, and good morning.
Yes, it is so glad for you to join us. And I have to start, because no one writes a book on the Nation of Islam without having their own journey with the Nation of Islam. So what is your journey to this book?
Well, thank you for that question. I've never been a member of the Nation of Islam. And that's the first thing people ask me, especially since I like the bow ties. That's purely aesthetic and professional. But growing up, of course, as an African-American Christian at the time, you know, the Nation of Islam was making sense out of being Black and religious in a way that was influential for me as it was for others. And so they've always been important to me to think about that relationship.
So I'm thinking, you know, I'm 57 years old. I imagine we're around the same age group. You might be a little younger.
Just a little.
But you would have come of age as a college student during that moment where Louis Farrakhan resurfaced as a national figure, both as the national spokesperson, you know, for the Nation of Islam, but obviously as a national political leader for many Black folks. What are your memories of thinking about who Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam was 30 years ago, 40 years ago? And how did that inform how you went about writing this book?
We do not believe, sir, that Black people should continue to depend on whites to do for us what we should be doing for ourselves. We believe that a lot of the responsibility must rest firmly on our own shoulders. We should turn that production power back into our own hands, build our own schools, our own factories, employ our own people. This would make a stronger Black people. It would make a stronger America if Blacks were allowed to do so.
It takes me back to Southern California, to be honest with you. I grew up in Santa Ana, California, which is in central Orange County. And if you know anything about Southern California and Orange County, Santa Ana was the only place where you had a sizable Black community in the entire county, probably about 10, 15 minutes south of Long Beach. And I just remember seeing Minister Farrakhan at the Los Angeles Sports Arena and the Coliseum. Growing up, I think I saw him probably at least twice in those venues. And again, Minister Farrakhan was always influential in terms of my thinking about what it means to be Black and religious, and at the same time to think about, you know, the politics of the day. And, you know, those are the first things that come to mind for me. One other thing, of course, I think it was at the sports arena, seeing Minister Farrakhan interact with the very large numbers of gangbangers who were there at the time, and the kind of respect that they had for him. Those are things that will always be prominent in my mind.
You make several interventions in this book. You know, one of them is to dispel of the idea that the Nation of Islam was simply a Black nationalist organization, right? You described them as religious nationalists, but also the way that you frame the labor and the work of the Nation of Islam, beginning with Elijah Muhammad, to think about it being about Black bodies that are in place and Black bodies that are out of place, right? And how the white gaze determine this sense of
Yep.
Black folks who are in their place and these Black folks who are out of their place. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, the early literature framed the Nation of Islam as a political group. And I'm thinking here about Sierra Lincoln's Black Muslims in America, which was the first book-length project on the Nation of Islam, and E.U. Easton Udum's book. I mean, it's called Black Nationalism, but it's on the Nation of Islam, which I believe came out in 62, 63, published by University of Chicago Press. And both of those texts really exhibited quite a bit of force on subsequent scholarship on the Nation of Islam, in that those few texts, at least initially, framed the Nation of Islam as primarily a political group, which for me is a mistake. Now Lawrence Mamiya was on my dissertation committee. Lawrence Mamiya has done a lot of work in Black religion, both on the Black church and the Nation of Islam. One of the things Mamiya points out is that Sierra Lincoln later corrected himself. And yet those perspectives of the Nation of Islam as a political group that is maybe just tangentially religious still have a lot of force on how people see the Nation of Islam, in particular, framing them as a Black nationalist group, which I thought was a mistake. And so I follow Tracy Hucks here, a good friend and Harvard professor at the Divinity School, and her work on African-American Yoruba adherents and how she thinks about them in the context of religious nationalism, which prioritizes religion, but also doesn't understand nationalism or that particular form of nationalism in terms of people who are trying to establish a nation state. Rather, people who see their identity and origins in other worlds as symbols to create new meanings in this world. In her language, new metaphysics, new ontologies.
You focus on these four transformative moments, right? Really moments in which there were distinct leaders of the Nation of Islam. Many folks, of course, know Malcolm X, right? He's been lionized. He's an icon, to the Black experience. Louis Farrakhan, of course, is the contemporary leader, so folks know of him for good and bad in that kind of moment.
Yes.
There's less attention in the contemporary moment to figures like Elijah Muhammad, and in particular, Warith Deen Mohammed. Talk a little bit about these four different men, their style of leadership,
Sure.
and what they bring to the table in terms of the Nation of Islam.
Well, let me pick up something first that I left out. You asked me about Black bodies in and out of place, and then I'll come back and talk about Warith Deen Mohammed and Elijah Muhammad. I wanted to think of a way of capturing the racial logics in which the Nation of Islam was working and to which they were responding. And so this Black bodies in and out of place is about space, of course, and like you suggest, perceptions of the white gaze as to that space, who belongs, who does not. And so I'm thinking of Black bodies in and out of place, not as a binary, but more of a matrix, since and it's about perception. And so the perception is that Black bodies can be in and out of place socially, in and out of place symbolically, or any combination of those. And the other thing that I think was really important for me was to note the relationship between embodiment, social systems, and cosmologies. I was really trying to make sense of that and how all of those are intertwined and indissociable. In other words, we can't separate how bodies are understood from the particular social system. And those social systems are always informed by cosmologies, ways of understanding the world, white supremacists in this case, or otherwise. And so I look at these four men through that lens and examine their understandings of the world, their rituals and discourses to try to make sense of where they were with respect to one another, how they critiqued one another. And you asked about Elijah Muhammad, and you're right. The majority of the work on the Nation of Islam right now focuses on Minister Farrakhan. Most people don't know that there are multiple nations of Islam. Mm-hmm. They only know Louis Farrakhan. But even today, there are multiple groups that understand themselves as the Nation of Islam, each competing for the rightful place, or to call themselves the Nation of Islam and to advance the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. So Minister Farrakhan and that Nation of Islam is just the most well-known of those groups. And so Elijah Muhammad was the first leader or prophet of the Nation of Islam. He comes on the scene early 1930s. He learns from Master Fard Muhammad, who claims to be God, or at least Elijah Muhammad sees him as God, and the early Nation of Islam does. And he claims to learn this mythology from Master Fard Muhammad, for studying with him for about 3 years about the nature of the universe, the origins of the races and the planets and the cosmos and so on. And this becomes really important as we think about the fact that he was reacting against a form of Black embodiment that carried the meaning of slavery, which was super important for him, and lynchings. Even one of his close friends was lynched when he was something like 10 or 11 years old. And so for him, these Black embodiment carried the negative meanings of all of this stuff, these philosophies of Black inferiority, slavery, and lynching. And he was first and foremost a religious leader who emphasized the religious meaning of Black body. So I argue then that he prioritized the symbolic, right? He was reacting against this meaning that came from this white gaze that rendered Black embodiment inferior. And he was most concerned with giving these bodies culture and meaning that was transcendent and not simply the product of white supremacy and white racial terror. And so the other figure that you asked about, Warith Deen Mohammed, was his son, Wallace, who was a really controversial figure in the Nation of Islam, in that he left the movement several times and came back out of fear. But he was also informed by other forms of Islam, global forms of Islam. And that's the reason why he left the Nation of Islam at times. And I argue, of course, that he prioritized both the social and the symbolic, but that he used these other forms of Islam to do that. He thought that Islam could ennoble, he even used that term, Black people, and that they needed to be cultured over against this, again, history of white racial terror. But it's a mistake now to see that race wasn't important to him, even though he embraced a more global form of Islam, where the narrative at least is that race doesn't matter. I mean, we know that it does from the long history of slavery on the continent of Africa by Arab Muslims and so on. And so he used symbols like Bilal ibn Rabah, the first prayer caller in Islam, as a symbol to ennoble and culture these Black bodies. And this is why he called African Americans Bilalians and suggested that that was the term by which African Americans should be known.
So you talked about Elijah Muhammad, his relationship with Minister Fard Muhammad. The foundational mythology, really not myth, of the Nation of Islam, of course, is the story of Yaqub. And I can always measure what somebody knows about the Nation of Islam based on whether or not they know the narrative of Yaqub. And I want to ask you this particular question, because, when you share the story of Yaqub with folks who don't know, it kind of blows their mind, right? Yeah. The processing all of this as early 20th century as they were, before we talked about DNA and genetics and stuff like that, out in the open. And I wanted to see if you came across a kind of moment where the Yaqub story, the historical moment where you could say this is the first time the story was been shared. And I asked that question because, in teaching Black satire, as I do from time to time, I'll teach George Schuyler's Black No More, right? Which is a story about a grafted, the grafting of a white race, right? And I often wondered whether or not Schuyler himself was commenting on what he might have known of the early moments of the Nation of Islam at that moment, or whether or not Master Fard Muhammad and then Elijah Muhammad had read Black No More and used that as kind of a foundational inspiration, to talk about this idea of Yaqub.
That's a great question that I'm not sure I can answer. I can only speculate. It could be that Schuyler had been familiar with the notion of Yaqub. The story of Yaqub is a story it's basically the Nation of Islam's cosmology. It is the way they put together. So think about the origin story in Genesis. It's basically an origin story that seeks to give coherence to Black life in the context of overwhelming, overdetermining white racial terror and violence, gratuitous violence against Black people. And so Yaqub becomes one of several angel scientists. For the Nation of Islam, angels are scientists. And Yaqub becomes one of many angel scientists along a long history of angel scientists who actually turns against the original people. Now, I have to say something about that. For the Nation of Islam, the original people, and these are Elijah Muhammad's terms, are Black, brown, red, and yellow. So when we say Black in the Nation of Islam, we're not talking about how we understand African Americans. For the Nation of Islam, Blackness is a metaphysical conception that I call a surplus category, in that it can't capture, Black that is, what they mean. I mean, it's sort of an overplus or surplus of meaning attached to that category. They mean Latinx communities, and in fact, there is a Latino Nation of Islam. They mean Asians, for which Japanese played a really significant role in the Nation of Islam and in their mythology. In fact, a Black Japanese scientist made the mother wheel. It was created in the Japanese islands in 1929. Native Americans are also Black. Minister Farrakhan and Nation of Islam have a significant relationship with the Hopi and the Navajo.
Yeah.
But Yaqub was disaffected, in the sense that these original people didn't speak the same language. And they were, in that sense, not unified. And so think about that as a form of a fall. And so he saw himself, right? He became self-aware and self-conscious. And Yaqub became dismayed and sought out to create a people, or to make a people who were, in Elijah Muhammad's term, an unlike people, who would destroy the original people. And that's where you get white people in this 600-year process of grafting or genetic engineering, the end of which, of course, is white. But the distinction is that Black people, these original people, were created. White people were made. Thus, this narrative is a Theodician narrative. One scholar just simply calls it a theodicy. It becomes a way of explaining Black suffering in the face of white terror and violence, and giving Black life coherence and a sense of transcendence, where in the world there were only bodies. So they were only immanence. And so this story of Yaqub then becomes this narrative that explains thousands, trillions for the Nation of Islam, years of history that make the world make sense. How else do you make sense of people being taken from a continent, right? And what was basically like the Afrofuturists say, an alien abduction, and brought to a new world, and the suffering just because they're Black. It makes no sense. The world is totally absurd. And so this narrative, which is named after this angel scientist Yaqub, who created white people in sort of this laboratory process, becomes a way to make the world make sense, gives the world coherence in the face of this gratuitous violence against Black people. It could also be the case that what links those two in the language of grafting is theosophy, a 19th century occult movement by Russian occultist Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, which was part of the Harlem Renaissance writers and philosophers and authors thinking about the world and thinking about race. This really great work by John Woodson, who has a chapter in my edited book, Esotericism, co-edited book, Esotericism in African American Religious Experience, where he actually argues that Harlem Renaissance writing is in fact esoteric. And he's talking about, Nella Larson's or Neil Hurston, that they were all in a secretive, private group that read occult literature, particularly that of G.I. Gurdjieff. And that this occult literature, which would include theosophy, was really the central literature in how they were even thinking about Blackness. And that they took this occult literature and made an intervention themselves because they used it to think about race,
right,
and Blackness. So it could be that what influenced them both is this theosophical influence that the Harlem Renaissance writers, or what some call the Harlem esoterics, may have encountered, as well as Master Fard Muhammad. There's reason to believe that he also encountered theosophy in Northern California. And so that could be the connection there, because we find language about grafting also in theosophy.
Thank you. That's really helpful. There are folks who will hear the rhetoric, contemporary rhetoric of Louis Farrakhan, at least pre-2020, or the rhetoric of Malcolm X, and they wonder why the Nation of Islam, as an idea, was so alluring to Black Americans, right? Black folks didn't go and join the Nation of Islam, right?
Not in great numbers.
There are a bunch of Black folks, just to be frank, that were not giving up their Sunday morning bacon. And we can talk about more of that in a moment, right? But there was something about the messaging of the Nation of Islam. And you talk about this early on around this idea of a politics of respectability, the idea of generating a Black industrial class that was making and selling things, again, drawing here from Booker T. Washington, and also the idea of stabilizing patriarchy, right, within Black communities. Talk a little bit about that in the context of how the Nation of Islam really presented itself to Black Americans.
Well, what you're talking about is in my book, where I'm trying to connect Elijah Muhammad with Black uplift motifs. And politics of respectability is one, and these other uplift motifs that sought to give Black people a sense of self and independence, which still resonated with African-American Christians, even though they didn't join the movement later on in droves. I mean, earlier, the Nation of Islam was primarily made up of former Christians during their early years in the 1930s and beyond. So it did appeal to them. In the 20th century, not so much. But there's still something about the Nation of Islam and Minister Farrakhan that appeals to African Americans and African American Christians and others, in the sense that, he speaks up to a world that many of us are afraid to speak up to. I mean, his social analysis of the priority in America of white supremacy is one that he has the courage to say that a lot of folks don't, but we're glad that he does, right? Because he says what so many others are thinking, but aren't necessarily willing to say in public. And so the Nation of Islam still appeals to a large number of African Americans, even though they're not necessarily willing to join the movement. And there are a couple other things, or something I wanted to share that escaped me. One of the things that I think the story of Yaqub and the Nation of Islam appeals to in Black people is a sense of difference and moral difference, right? That there's something really different about Black people and white people. And I don't see this as a racial essentialism. I see this as Black people. One of the things that connects, I think, Black people to this narrative is this idea that we could never be violent toward other people like that. Now, I'm not saying that's true or not,
Right.
But I'm saying, I think that's one of the things about the story of Yakub, the story that white people were made in this process. And this is the explanation for this white racial terror and this incessant violence over hundreds of years, particularly toward Black bodies, that appeals to Black people, right? That the story of Yakub says there's a reason why people are different. But that Black people, in a sense, are different, but at the moral level. And I think that appeals to a lot of Black people, true or not. There are a lot of Black people who can't see us ever being violent in that same way toward other people.
Absolutely. I joked earlier a few minutes ago about, pork, but, if there's a book that someone who's not interested really in the Nation of Islam who has read about the Nation of Islam, it's Eat to Live.
Yeah.
Right? And we still have that resonance in the 21st century, right? Folks who walk into a bookstore and will see that and will buy that, because of what that means in terms of how Black folks are thinking about self-care and their diet,
that's right,
et cetera. But when you unpack that book and this ideal as you do in your book, it really was about disconnecting Black folks from these foods, from these symbols that were connected to slavery. I remember watching a video a few years ago about, the significance of the bean pie, right? And they're made with navy beans, right? And very consciously, right, pushing aside sweet potatoes because of their connection to slavery, right? But we still want to be able to serve farm to table, right? Throughout the ranks, right? So, let's come up with this thing called the navy bean.
Final call, we got that bean pie, delicious and nutritious. What we're doing is we're unifying our people, Black people, stopping the violence in the community.
But talk about how important it was, to connect Black diet as a disconnect from this larger history of enslavement.
So two things. One, again, we're talking about the social. The other, we're talking about the symbolic. Right. With regard to the social, we're talking about these physical bodies. Think about slavery. Black life expectancy might have been, 20 years? You were fortunate to be 25 years. So we're talking about prolonging the life of bodies that were severely curtailed, through and in these American violent systems such as slavery. And the second, of course, is the symbolic. And the symbolic, just as you suggested, as I write in my book, were for Elijah Muhammad, a lot of these foods were associated with slavery. And so how do we disrupt that? We come up with these new diets, these new ways of eating and thinking about the body that both enrich the body physically, but then change and heighten, according to Elijah Muhammad, Nation of Islam, the meaning of Black bodies symbolically. And then, of course, one other thing, there are other things in the Yakub narrative that participated in this. According to Elijah Muhammad, he learned from Master Fard Muhammad that there was Black life on Mars and Venus that was trillions of years old. And so again, you hear this need to make Black bodies ancient and not solely the product of slavery and 100 years of lynching and all these philosophies of Black inferiority. So the meaning of these bodies then can't be captured simply by the stuff that happens in this world. And they're also connected, according to their mythology, which I'm calling mythology. For them, it's history.
Right.
To these Black bodies on Mars and Venus, which were 9 feet tall, which lived to be 1,100, 1,200 years old. And so you hear in that then sort of idealizing a goal, or at least what Black bodies can be in their ideal in all these discourses and narratives and rituals, such that we, as what we find in the 2 volumes, How to Eat to Live.
When I read the quotes in your book that are directly from Elijah Muhammad, I'm old enough to have remembered Elijah Muhammad's voice. And if not, I can remember Al Freeman's.
I tell you, the most dangerous creation in the world, in any society, is the man with nothing to lose.
Version of Elijah Muhammad. So when I read those quotes, I hear Elijah Muhammad's voice, right? And I mention that because of why Malcolm X was so significant to the Nation of Islam, right? Elijah Muhammad was never going to project the kind of charisma,
That's right.
right, that the organization needed to grow. Malcolm X, in his youth, in his vigor, and in his height,
That's
and
right.
in his oratory skill, represented that kind of charisma.
That's
But
right.
as you mentioned in the book, right, we often have this narrative of Malcolm X breaking with the Nation of Islam and then having these critiques of the Nation of Islam post breakage, right?
Sure.
There's a way in which the reasons that we know of publicly why they broke in terms of some of Elijah Muhammad's, habits.
Sure.
You can understand why they would have been threatening to Elijah Muhammad, right? Because it's a presentation of the stereotypical Black person, right, that he's built this whole organization around. But as you talk about, Malcolm X had already had critiques of the Nation of Islam around this idea of the social versus the symbolic.
That's right.
Right. The idea that the Nation of Islam, particularly in that moment, needed to be engaged socially and politically in a way that Elijah Muhammad resisted. Can you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Sure. I'd be happy to, but I also want to say something about, because you said a lot of things that were important there. I want to say something about Elijah Muhammad, because even though he was unlettered and didn't have much formal education, Elijah Muhammad still held together this religious group that had all these powerful personalities within, men and women. I mean, we're talking Farrakhan, Malcolm X, John Muhammad, Muhammad Ali, and so many others. And yet this man was still able to hold that together and to remain the leader. And his leadership was never questioned or threatened. But here comes Malcolm X, to your point, a man who was brilliant, who said he read enough in jail, whether it's true or not, to where he should have had maybe a master's degree. He said he did that level of reading, right? He said he was reading philosophy and Schopenhauer and all these complicated works. And of course, there's some questions about the autobiography. I'm sure you're well aware of those, as I am. But he comes along, he's tall, he's lighter complexion, he's articulate and charismatic, and he really is the cause for the Nation of Islam growing and proliferating throughout the country, and especially in the West, its movement westward. Malcolm X saw himself as a sort of Billy Graham, and actually he used that term, he made that reference. He wanted to be for the Nation of Islam what Billy Graham was for white Pentecostals, that he wanted to go out and proliferate the message and to build mosques and so on. And yet it didn't mean that because he was loyal to Elijah Muhammad, very loyal, that he didn't have his own mind.
Right.
And Malcolm thought that the Nation of Islam could have injected a militarism in the civil rights movement that would have benefited the civil rights movement. But remember, Elijah Muhammad privileged the symbolic. Right. He was trying to create these religious bodies, these people who would be ready for the end of the age of white domination when the mother plane would return, right? And bring an end to this age of white supremacy. Malcolm wasn't willing to wait. But the fact that he wasn't willing to wait tells you that there's at least an implied critique of that theology. Right. That there was no need to be involved politically because the mother plane was going to come back at the end of the age and handle all that. So the fact that he wanted to engage tells you that he had some doubts about that. And so it's at least an implied critique of Elijah Muhammad and a privileging of the social, since he wanted these bodies physically, Black people physically, to be engaged in bringing freedom to fruition.
After Malcolm X's death, Louis X, who we now know as Minister Louis Farrakhan, ascends to that position of national spokesperson. When Elijah Muhammad dies in February of 1975, you would think the expectation would be that Farrakhan would ascend, but it's not, right? It's Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Deen Mohammed. Talk a little bit about that, how that process went down, and in particular, when Muhammad chooses to excommunicate Farrakhan in 78, right? And
Yes.
Farrakhan goes about the business of rebuilding the Nation of Islam, his version of the Nation of Islam.
Well, you're right. I mean, all the signs were there. Minister Louis Farrakhan was the minister of Temple number 7 in Harlem. I mean, that's the number 1 temple. That's the same temple that Malcolm X was the minister of, and Malcolm X was understood as the number 2 man, a term which he despised.
Yeah.
But people saw him as the successor, and part of that means being the minister of Temple number 7. Minister Farrakhan, again, was also robust. He was lighter complexion. So all the signs were there that he was going to be the guy who would take over after Elijah Muhammad. He was the national representative. Now Minister Farrakhan makes a distinction here. He says Malcolm X was the national spokesperson or spokesman. He, that is Farrakhan, was the national representative. He makes a real qualitative distinction there. But then Elijah Muhammad dies in February 1975, and Minister Farrakhan is sort of outmaneuvered and according to some records, even threatened by Wallace, Elijah Muhammad's son, who later changed his name to Warith Deen Mohammed. And Wallace takes over the nation and immediately starts to dismantle some of the teachings and some of the mechanical looks of the temples. Starts calling them mosques. In line with other forms of Islam rather than temples. And Minister Farrakhan sees this as he sees these moves that Warith makes as in some way sort of disrespectful to the memory and the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Again, he was the representative of Elijah Muhammad. Minister Farrakhan says, when you see me, you see Elijah Muhammad. And so he should have been, in the minds of a lot of folks, and probably in his own, the rightful heir to the Nation of Islam. So it was around 1977, maybe 1978, where he confided with actor, I don't know if you remember Brock Peters.
Yes.
He told Brock Peters, I'm thinking about doing something else. And so at that point, he made up in his mind to reconstitute the Nation of Islam. And so the Nation of Islam under Minister Farrakhan is really a new Nation of Islam.
Yeah.
It took very few members from maybe a remnant from Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam and from Warith Deen Mohammed. And most of this is really, really new. And most of the members are
really new. Yeah. You mentioned that part of his praxis in the rebuilding of the Nation of Islam is that it really is kind of a culmination of the styles and intended leadership of Elijah Muhammad, Warith Deen Mohammed, and Malcolm X. Talk a little bit about that.
Again, Minister Farrakhan sees himself as the representative of Elijah Muhammad. He says he hasn't changed any of the teachings. When you see him, you see Elijah Muhammad. So he sees himself as a true embodiment of Elijah Muhammad in a way that Warith Deen Mohammed and all of these other rival nations of Islam are not. But he also privileges the social in a way that Malcolm X did. Like he wants Black bodies to be engaged socially and in this world. And he does too. I mean, he speaks out on white supremacy all the time. You remember the Million Man March speech, 2.5 hours, where he talked about white supremacy. That's not his longest speech. That's not his longest speech. Not even close.
Look at you. Oh, I don't know what the number is. It's too much for me to count. But I think they said it's 1.5 million or 2. I don't know how many. But I called for 1 million.
But where he intersects with Warith Deen Mohammed is Islam is also important to him.
Right.
And so after 1985, which is really important, an important year for him, he goes on this world friendship tour where he visits these nations in Africa and in the Near East, many of which, if not most of which, were Muslim nations.
Right, including Libya and Muammar Gaddafi.
Right. That's exactly right. And so, but for Minister Farrakhan, they are authentically Muslim, but there's also something really unique about the African-American, or I shouldn't say the African-American experience, about African-American experience that Islam can't capture. There's a universal and there's a particular. And so when you put all of that together, you really see all of his predecessors, right? And at the same time, there's still something unique. There's a remainder of Minister Farrakhan that's uniquely Farrakhan as well.
You know, he was tremendously savvy in those early years of the new Nation of Islam. I think specifically, you know, his support for Jesse Jackson. Yeah. You know, the first time the Nation of Islam, in whatever variation, had encouraged its members to participate in electoral projects.
That's right.
Right. The idea symbolically of this coming together of the lieutenants of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, right, that which was very appealing, particularly to young Black men at that time.
Yes.
And I attended Savior's Day in 1985 in Chicago. It's the first time I heard him speak in person. And my experience there spoke to one of the things that you write about in the book. Because I was not in the nation, I felt outside of it in a certain kind of way, right? And it was something that was more than just not being part of the group. You articulate this idea that what comes through in the Nation of Islam, whether consciously or unconsciously on the part of the members in the leadership, is that the Nation of Islam represents a particular classed version of the Black body, the Black experience, that pushes out other kinds of folks from seeing themselves as being part of that movement in that community.
Yes, and I want to be careful here, because I do think the Nation of Islam is doing something at the primary level, which is to say that human beings are race, class, and gender.
Right.
The Nation of Islam is trying to reconceptualize what it means to be whoever they are, perhaps a new human, but they're thinking in terms of the extraterrestrial, in terms of gods. And part of what's implied in my work is that they're trying to jettison on the primary level this grammar of domination. That is, that African Americans were largely outside the human in modernity. And again, humans are classed, gendered, raced.
Right.
So where does that leave Black people in the Nation of Islam, which is trying to retool and rethink about their meaning and the meaning of Black embodiment in this world? And so when I think about class, I'm careful not to think in terms of Marxism, but to think more in terms of Pierre Bourdieu, and to think of how the religion creates a new field of meaning. And it's on that particular field where I argue Black embodiment is stratified, that there's this ideal Black body economy that functions throughout the life of the Nation of Islam that gives us something like an indeterminate or ambiguous class system with respect to the religion and how the religion sees other Black bodies, for Elijah Muhammad, in particular Christian ones, which were the worst. Negro Christians, and Farrakhan agrees, Elijah Muhammad and Negro Christians, right? They were the lowest form of Black embodiment. And in fact, were closer to slave bodies, right, than those which were constituted in and by the Nation of Islam.
Right. And embedded in those critiques, of course, are the ways that the Nation of Islam has historically dealt with women, have dealt with homosexuality.
Correct.
Right. You know, that at least in this kind of moment of woke politics, right, you know, makes Farrakhan a fairly interesting figure, right, in representation of a kind of not Black radical, but Black militant tradition.
It sure does. And again, Farrakhan is also really complicated. So you mentioned 2020. In 2020, you know, his speech, which was about 3.5 hours to Criterion, complicates all of that. It almost makes, to use your language, Minister Farrakhan illegible over against all these other narratives about who he is. I mean, he's talking about queer people. He's talking about women. And he uses the term queer and LGBTQ in the context of both race and the pandemic,
Right.
and argues that people who died during the pandemic are martyrs. They're martyrs in Islam. These are people who are going to heaven. And again, this is very universal because he's talking about the meaning and value of LGBTQ communities and women and people all across the world. And it's a Farrakhan who is illegible over against some of these narratives and stereotypes through which many people have come to know him or not know him. Because I argue that there's always been these elements when it comes to fruition here as of 2020.
Yeah, I often go back to the TV show that was on PBS back in the day, when he sits down with Ellis Hazlitt.
We cannot become a strong people unless we become a disciplined people. We cannot become a mighty nation except we put our passions under control.
Who's an out Black gay man, on hosting the television show Soul, and the two of them sit down and have a conversation.
Yes.
Right. It's kind of these moments where, he is self-aware of the multiplicity of Blackness, right, that exists in the Black community, despite the rhetoric that we hear. But we were just talking about illegibility, right? And if there is one thing that will mark Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam as illegible to many folks in this moment, it is the mother wheel.
I knew you were going to go there.
And again, one of the great interventions that you make in this book is that you take this rhetoric serious. You don't just set it aside, right, as this kind of weird aspect of the Nation of Islam, or this part where Farrakhan jumped the shark.
Yes.
You take it as part of what has always been this cosmology.
That's right.
That is part of the Nation of Islam. So talk about the mother wheel, if you could.
September 17th, 1985, Minister Farrakhan, with a group of friends that included Jibril Muhammad, his wife Khadijah Muhammad, and others, took this trek. I mean, that's basically what it was, to Mexico, where he climbed the ruins of the ancient Aztec deity Quetzalcoatl. And he says that he has this vision, which wasn't a dream, it was very real, of this wheel, this vehicle, what he would say the world would recognize as a UFO, coming over the mountain and summoning him into it. He talks about being afraid, in fact, and looked around for his friends, the people who were with him, and heard a voice coming from it that said, "Not them, just you." And that this vehicle, which was a smaller wheel, took him into it and whisked him away to this larger mother wheel in the sky, where he encountered the presence of Master Fard Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad, and heard the voice of Elijah Muhammad through these prophetic utterances. He says, as clearly as you and your audience are hearing my voice right now.
Elijah Muhammad, I'm filled up this morning. Go ahead. Go ahead. Because I was taken up on the wheel in a vision. September 1985. And I heard the voice of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad speaking to me from that wheel, on that wheel. And I described what I was shown. Yes. Yes. And his voice was as clear as my voice is to you, telling me what Reagan was about to do.
And it's this event, this what I call an authorizing event, that sets Minister Farrakhan apart from all this other noise in the world of the people who claim to be the authentic legacy of the Nation of Islam, including Silas Muhammad and John Muhammad and all these other nations of Islam. None of them can make the claim, as Farrakhan does, to have actually been taken into this mother wheel and heard the voice of Elijah Muhammad. This initiates him into another world, into a mystical space. It anoints him a prophet. It gives him his mission. And so this UFO encounter then becomes a way of understanding Minister Farrakhan, in that it gives his life coherence. In fact, I argue it's the most important religious idea in the Nation of Islam. Now, why this doesn't show up in this way in other scholarship, your guess is as good as mine. But this is the most important idea of the Nation of Islam. So I couldn't ignore it. And so so not only then is Minister Farrakhan reborn, so to speak, through this experience of being taken into this mother wheel, he emerges from it. So think about a pregnancy and birth. He emerges from it, this new person, this sage who is on the level of Jesus and Muhammad and Abraham and other prophets. But it's also a symbol for what Black bodies can be, right? This is a technology that even NASA, according to Elijah Muhammad, can't master, right? It says something about the wisdom and intellect and scientific and mathematical wisdom of Black people, right? So it becomes then it's super complicated in terms of what it means for Farrakhan and his own body, but also other Black bodies in the world, in that it symbolizes their mastery of the universe and over science and mathematics and so on. And so after this encounter in 1985, Farrakhan faces the world with this new hubris, because this mother wheel, he says, follows him and protects him, gives him its meaning. He threatens the government, right? Y'all better watch what you say about me, and do. Because he says in one speech, if I am only scratched by you, you will be totally destroyed completely or destroyed completely. So this mother wheel is everything, both to the Nation of Islam, to Minister Farrakhan, and to how they ultimately understand Black bodies as both transcendent and immanent. We can't talk about the Nation of Islam without talking about it. We can't even talk about what we might even think of as race and gender without even talking about this mother wheel.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the legacy of the Nation of Islam and Farrakhan at this moment. Well, my wife and I were on a flight with the Honorable Minister and his wife and a few other folks a few years ago, flying from Atlanta to Chicago. And what struck me about landing in Chicago, right? And of course, it was a whole contingent who was with them at the airport in Atlanta, aided by the Atlanta Police Department, at least the Black folks in the department.
Yeah.
And then a contingent who met them in Chicago. And what struck me was the age of the folks who met them in Chicago. These were all, relatively elderly men.
Yes.
Late 60s and 70s. And it made me wonder where the Nation of Islam is going to reproduce itself.
Yeah.
Again, the Farrakhan was so savvy, 30, 40 years ago, making those connections to hip hop, the way that he utilized folks like Chuck D and Ice Cube to help proselytize, the way he understood how to intervene in gang culture. When there were beefs, I'm thinking about Ice Cube and Common having beef, and folks knew if Farrakhan called, you came for the sit down because he was Farrakhan.
That's right.
How does this organization reproduce itself in this moment where its leadership is so much older and it seems so out of sync with the progressive politics of young Black folks in this moment?
That's a tough question, because like you pointed out, on some level, Minister Farrakhan always has the respect of young people.
Yeah.
And young people who are on the margins. Yeah. Gangbangers. I think about, again, my early experiences in Los Angeles seeing Minister Farrakhan and these large groups of Crips and Bloods. Again, I grew up in Southern California, competing with one another to see who could give the most money to the Nation of Islam. and the guy who's announcing $500 from the Crips, right? and then another announcement, the Bloods, $1,000 from the Bloods, right? and so, and again, the relationship between the Nation of Islam and hip hop and those young people, it's hard to say where the Nation of Islam goes. Minister Farrakhan is Maybe he'll be 90 this year, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's up there. But one of the things that he did when he was sick in 2006 and 2007, during the time when I was trying to reach him for an interview, which did not happen, is he started a council of men and women made up of leaders in the Nation of Islam, quite diverse. And that council, I think, will lead the Nation of Islam. But again, it also means that the movement isn't so dependent on one person and one personality. And Minister Farrakhan says, he says, look, I can do what I want, but I try to bring what I want to do in line with what the council wants. And so he tries to bring his desires in line with the council, because he wants to position the council as this body who really can carry out the business of the Nation of Islam. Of course, earlier this year, we lost one of the prominent members, Sister Ava Mohammed, who was on that council, who was a minister at the mosque in Atlanta. And so it's going to be up to this council. But I think this council is diverse enough, really, to do something unique and different with the Nation of Islam. But he cautions them not to change his teachings. So there's that. He says that explicitly. Don't change my teachings, just as I didn't change Elijah Muhammad's teachings. So we'll have to see where that goes.
We've been joined today by Professor Stephen C. Finley, Inaugural Chair in the Department of African Studies at Louisiana State University. He joined us today to talk about his new book, In and Out of This World, Material and Extraterrestrial Bodies in the Nation of Islam, published by Duke University Press. Thank you for joining us, Professor Finley.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. By the way, my students, when I taught Black intellectual thought, they like New Black Man. They had some questions, but they like New Black Man.
I appreciate hearing that, brother.
You're welcome.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything.